23 men stood at the rail of the SS Daniel J. Morell on the night of November 14, 1977, watching something that should not have existed pace their vessel through the black waters of Lake Superior. She moved through water cold enough to kill an unprotected human in 4 minutes. Yet she showed no distress, no struggle, no urgency, only a terrible patience, as she kept pace with a 600-foot freighter making 12 knots. For 1 hour and 18 miles, from the open waters east of Whitefish Point to the shipping channel approaching the Sioux Locks, she followed them. And when it was over, when she finally dove beneath the surface and did not return, 23 men made a decision that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. Only 4 would ever admit what they saw. The others took it to their graves, or carry it still a memory they've never spoken aloud, not to their wives, not to their children, not to the maritime authorities, who might have revoked their credentials for reporting the impossible. But to understand what those men witnessed that November night, we need to go back to the beginning of a voyage that started like any other. The Daniel J. Morell was not a young ship in 1977, but she was a reliable 1-600-foot bulk freighter that had spent her career hauling iron ore pellets from the mines of Minnesota to the steel mills of the lower Great Lakes. She had been built in 1906, rebuilt twice in the decades since, and possessed the particular character that old vessels acquire when they've survived long enough to earn the respect of the men who sail them. Her crew approached the November run with a particular blend of caution and confidence that comes only from repetition, knowing that this would be among the last crossings before the winter layup brought the shipping season to its annual close. Harold Pemberton had served as her first mate for 3 seasons, though his time on the lakes stretched back 26 years to when he was a green deckhand who didn't yet understand that Superior could kill you faster than the North Atlantic. At 52, Pemberton carried himself with the quiet authority of a man who had seen too much to be easily impressed and survived too much to be easily frightened. He had served as a machinist's mate on a destroyer during the worst years of Vietnam, had watched men die in ways that still visited him in dreams, and had returned to the lakes believing that nothing in freshwater could match what he'd witnessed in the South China Sea. His hands bore the calluses of a lifetime of physical labor, his face the weathering of decades spent in wind and cold, and his eyes the particular steadiness that came from having confronted mortality and learned to live alongside its constant presence. That belief, that certainty that he had already seen the worst the world could offer, would not survive the night of November 14th. The Morell departed Duluth on November 12th under skies that promised nothing good. Low gray clouds stretching to every horizon, the kind of ceiling that pressed down on a man's spirits and made the water look like hammered lead. She carried a full load of iron ore pellets in her holds, 25,000 tons that put her riding low in the water with a particular heaviness that experienced sailors both respected and feared. A loaded freighter handles differently than an empty one, responds more slowly to the helm, takes longer to stop, and sits deep enough that waves break against her hull rather than passing beneath. The deck seemed closer to the water than it did when they ran empty, and the spray came over the rails more frequently, coating everything in a thin film of moisture that turned to ice when the temperature dropped far enough. Captain William Stoddard had made the decision to depart despite the weather, service's warnings about deteriorating conditions, a choice that was neither unusual nor reckless by the standards of November shipping on Superior. The insurance companies wanted the ore delivered before the winter layup. The mining companies wanted their holds emptied, and the steel mills wanted their raw material, and all of that pressure flowed downhill until it reached the captains who had to weigh economics against survival every time they cast off lines. Stoddard was 61 years old and 8 months from retirement, a man counting down the crossings until he could finally stop watching the barometer like it held the secrets of his continued existence. He ran a tight ship without being tyrannical about it, trusted his officers to do their jobs, and had earned the reputation across the fleet as someone who brought his vessels home. In 40 years on the lakes, he had never lost a man to anything but natural causes, a record that meant more to him than any commendation from the shipping company could have. Pemberton respected him deeply, which was not something the first mate granted easily to anyone who hadn't earned it through years of demonstrated competence. The first day of the crossing passed without incident, the Morell making steady progress eastward through swells that never exceeded 4 feet. The weather held better than the forecasts had suggested, the clouds maintaining their gray ceiling, but refusing to deliver the storms that the radio had warned about. The crew fell into their watches with the automatic efficiency of men who had done this work so many times that their bodies knew the rhythms before their minds engaged. There was a particular comfort in routine. Pemberton reflected away that the familiar patterns of shipboard life created a buffer against the uncertainties that waited beyond the hull. He spent his off hours in his cabin reviewing cargo manifests and maintenance logs, the paperwork that accumulated like sediment, no matter how diligently he tried to stay ahead of it. He ate dinner in the officers' mess with the captain and the chief engineer, the conversation touching on weather, the upcoming layup, and the Tiger's disappointing season, before returning to his cabin for 4 hours of sleep that felt like 40 minutes. When he relieved the second mate at midnight on November 14th, taking the watch that would change everything he thought he understood about the world, Pemberton noted nothing unusual in the logbook or in the water stretching away from the Morell's bow. The night was cold 32 degrees, according to the thermometer mounted outside the wheelhouse, and the overcast had thickened until the darkness felt absolute, broken only by the freighter's running lights and the faint glow of the instrument panels inside. Lake Superior lay black and choppy beneath them, 3-foot swells that made the deck pitch gently without causing any real concern. Pemberton could see perhaps a quarter-mile in any direction before the darkness swallowed everything, the kind of visibility that demanded attention without quite qualifying as dangerous. He poured himself coffee from the pot that was always brewing in the wheelhouse and settled into the familiar routine of monitoring instruments, checking positions, and watching the empty water ahead. The radar showed nothing but the usual clutter of wave returns, the depth finder reading the expected numbers for their position east of Whitefish Point. Everything was normal. Everything was exactly as it should be. It was 12:40 when Thomas Kowalski, a 24-year-old deckhand from Sault Ste. Marie, appeared in the wheelhouse doorway with an expression that Pemberton would remember for the rest of his life. The younger man's face held something between confusion and fear, the look of someone who had seen something he couldn't process and desperately wanted an authority figure to explain it away. Kowalski was a good worker, reliable and steady, in a way that had made Pemberton notice him among the rotating cast of deckhands who came and went with the seasons. He had been on deck securing a hatch cover that had been rattling in the wind, a routine task that should have taken 5 minutes and attracted no attention whatsoever. His hair was damp with spray, and his cheeks were red from the cold, but it was his eyes that caught Pemberton's attention, wide and uncertain in a way that had nothing to do with the weather. His voice, when he finally spoke, came out thin and unsteady, as if he wasn't sure he should be saying the words at all. "Mr. Pemberton, there's something in the water off the port side." Pemberton set down his coffee and studied the deckhand's face, searching for signs of drinking or exhaustion, or the kind of joke that young sailors sometimes attempted with their officers. He found none of those things, only a genuine bewilderment that made the hair on his arms stand up despite the warmth of the wheelhouse. "What kind of something, Kowalski?" The deckhand shook his head slowly, as if the motion might dislodge an answer that made sense. "I don't know, sir. I thought it was a person." "A woman? But that's not possible, is it? Not out here. Not in this water." The words hung in the air of the wheelhouse, impossible, and yet spoken with complete sincerity by a man who had never given Pemberton any reason to doubt his judgment. Pemberton felt something cold settle in his chest that had nothing to do with the November air. He told the helmsman to maintain course and speed, then followed Kowalski out onto the deck, the wind cutting through his jacket as soon as he left the shelter of the wheelhouse. The temperature drop felt like stepping into a freezer, the kind of cold that seeped through clothing and into bone within minutes, the kind of cold that killed swimmers in the time it took to call for help. The deck was slick with spray and required careful footwork, the non-skid surface doing its job, but still demanding respect from anyone who didn't want to end up sliding into the rail or worse. Pemberton walked to the port rail and looked out over the black surface of Lake Superior, his eyes straining against the darkness as Kowalski pointed toward a spot perhaps 50 yards from the hull. For a long moment he saw nothing, only waves and darkness and the faint reflection of the Morell's running lights on the water. The lake stretched away into nothing, indistinguishable from the sky at this hour, a void that could have contained anything or nothing at all. Then something broke the surface, and Harold Pemberton's understanding of the possible world ended. She rose from the water with a motion that suggested no effort whatsoever, her head and shoulders emerging as smoothly as if she were standing up from a reclined position rather than surfacing, from a lake whose depths held temperatures cold enough to stop a human heart. The running lights caught her more clearly than Pemberton would have wished, and what he saw bore only a superficial resemblance to the woman Kowalski had described. The shape was female, yes, in the broadest anatomical sense, with dark hair plastered to a skull that seemed slightly too long, and features that appeared almost human until you noticed that the proportions were wrong in ways that the brain registered before the mind could articulate. Her face was pale as drowned flesh, a gray-white pallor that spoke of depths where sunlight never reached, and her skin seemed too smooth, too unmarked by the lines and blemishes that would have indicated a human life lived in a human way. The eyes were too large and too dark, holding no reflection of the lights that illuminated the rest of her face, as if they absorbed light rather than reflecting it. They were black all the way through, no iris, no white, nothing but depthless darkness that seemed to look not at him but into him, cataloging something about his nature that he couldn't have named. The neck bent at an angle that would have been impossible for a human spine, turning to track the freighter's movement with a fluidity that suggested joints that worked differently than any Pemberton had seen. And she was keeping pace with them, not struggling to match their speed, not fighting the water, but moving through it with the same easy grace that a dolphin might show, maintaining her position off the port beam, as if the 12 knots the Morell was making presented no challenge whatsoever. Pemberton gripped the rail hard enough to feel the cold metal through his gloves, and for a moment he was back in Vietnam, watching things come out of the jungle that his training had not prepared him for. The difference was that those things had been human, driven by ideology and desperation comprehensible, even when they were trying to kill you. What moved through the water beside the Daniel J. Morell was not human, and Pemberton understood that fact with a certainty that bypassed thought entirely and lodged itself directly in the oldest, most primitive part of his brain. He turned to Kowalski and saw his own incomprehension reflected in the younger man's face, and something in that shared recognition made the situation feel slightly more bearable, if no more explicable. "Get the captain," Pemberton said, his voice steadier than he would have expected. "And keep your mouth shut about what you're getting him for." Kowalski nodded once and disappeared toward the officers' quarters, his footsteps echoing on the deck plates with an urgency that suggested he was grateful for an excuse to look away from the water. Pemberton remained at the rail, watching the figure that paced them, counting the seconds until she submerged again, or turned away, or did anything that might suggest this was a temporary phenomenon rather than a sustained escort. She did not submerge. She did not turn away. She continued to pace the freighter with that terrible patience, her dark eyes fixed on the deck where Pemberton stood, and the first mate had the disquieting sense that she was aware of his observation, that her attention was not on the vessel, but on the man who was watching her. Captain Stoddard arrived on deck 4 minutes later, his coat thrown over his nightclothes. his white hair standing up in directions that suggested he had been deeply asleep when Kowalski came knocking. The annoyance on his face lasted until he reached the rail and looked where Pemberton was pointing, and then it was replaced by something that the first mate had never seen on the captain's features in 3 years of sailing together. Stoddard went very still, his hands finding the rail with the automatic grip of a man who had spent his life on ships, and for nearly a minute he said nothing at all. His breathing slowed, his jaw tightened, and his eyes narrowed with the particular focus of a man who was forcing himself to observe rather than react, to gather information before allowing emotion to drive his response. When he finally spoke, his voice was flat and controlled, the voice of a man who had decided to approach an impossible situation with the same methodical calm he would bring to any other emergency. How long has it been there? 7 minutes since Kowalski spotted it. Possibly longer. We don't know when it first appeared. The captain nodded slowly, his eyes never leaving the figure in the water. It's keeping pace with us. Matching our speed exactly. Yes, sir. She hasn't fallen back or pulled ahead since I've been watching. It's like she's locked onto our position. That water's 38 degrees, maybe colder. Core temperature drop would incapacitate a swimmer in under 2 minutes. Death in under 10. We're making 12 knots. The fastest human swimmer in the world couldn't sustain half that speed for more than a few seconds. Sir, Stoddard turned to look at Pemberton directly, and in the dim light from the running lamps, the first mate could see that the captain's face had taken on a grayish pallor that had nothing to do with the cold. So what we're looking at isn't human. No, sir. I don't believe it is. The captain was silent for another long moment, his gaze returning to the figure that continued her escort alongside them. And when he spoke again, his voice had dropped low enough that Kowalski, standing 10 feet away, would not have been able to hear it. I've spent 40 years on these lakes, Harrow. My father spent 40 years before me. Between us, that's 80 years of experience on Superior, Michigan, Huron, Erie, Ontario, every body of water in this system. Neither of us ever saw anything like this, never heard a credible report of anything like this from anyone we trusted. The old Indians had their stories. Sure, every body of water has its legends, but stories aren't the same as whatever that thing is. Pemberton had no response to offer, no explanation that would make the situation comprehensible, so he simply stood beside his captain and watched the figure that watched them back. By 12:50, word had begun to spread through the vessel, despite Pemberton's instructions to Kowalski. Ships are small communities, and secrets travel through them with the speed of electricity through copper wire. A deckhand tells an oiler. The oiler tells a cook. The cook mentions it to a steward. And within 15 minutes, the entire crew knows something is happening on deck. They came up in ones and twos, men abandoning their bunks and their card games and their half-eaten sandwiches to see what had drawn the captain and the first mate to the port rail in the middle of the night. Pemberton watched them approach and watched their faces change as they saw what waited in the water. And in each man's expression, he recognized the same sequence of emotions: disbelief first, the automatic assumption that this must be a joke or an illusion or a trick of the lights, followed by recognition that what they were seeing was real and present and not going away, followed finally by a fear that seemed to reach down into something older than thought. Some of the men crossed themselves. Some muttered prayers in languages Pemberton didn't speak Polish, Finnish, the particular variant of French that the Québécois used. One man, a young oiler named Marcus Webb, who had only been with the fleet for 2 seasons, simply sat down on the deck with his back against the winch housing and stared at the water with an expression that suggested his mind had temporarily stopped processing what his eyes were reporting. By 1 o'clock, nearly the entire off-duty crew had gathered along the port rail, a line of 20 men in various states of dress, staring at the figure that continued to pace them through the black water of Lake Superior. Nobody spoke above a whisper. Nobody made jokes or offered theories or suggested explanations. They simply watched, bound together by a shared experience of the impossible, while the Morell continued her eastward passage toward the Sulaks and whatever waited beyond. The figure submerged periodically, disappearing beneath the surface for intervals that ranged from 30 seconds to nearly 3 minutes. Then each time she went under, Pemberton found himself holding his breath, hoping against his own awareness that she would not return. Each time she did return, she would surface in a slightly different position, sometimes closer to the hull, sometimes farther away, occasionally visible off the stern, as if she had dropped back to inspect the freighter's propeller wash. But she always returned to that spot off the port beam, always resumed her patient pacing, always watched them with those eyes that held no light. The pattern repeated with a regularity that began to feel almost ritualistic, as if the diving and surfacing served some purpose that the watching men could not comprehend. At 1:15, she surfaced close enough to the hull that the running lights illuminated her with terrible clarity, and for the first time, Pemberton was able to see the full extent of what had been following them. Below the waterline, where human legs should have been, the figure's body extended into something that the first mate's mind refused to fully process: a tail, or something like a tail, that moved with a powerful undulation, wholly unlike any fish he had ever seen. The proportions were wrong for any marine animal he could name, too long for a seal, too sinuous for a porpoise, tapering to ragged fins that looked torn or ancient or both. The fins seemed damaged in ways that suggested violence rather than natural wear, as if something had fought with her at some point in the past and left its mark on her body. Scales caught the light in places, silver-gray plates that seemed to merge with the pale flesh of her upper body in a way that suggested they were not separate elements, but gradations of a single impossible anatomy. The transition was gradual rather than abrupt, human-seeming skin giving way to something else as it descended toward the water's surface, until what remained visible was entirely inhuman. Someone behind Pemberton whispered something in Polish a prayer. He thought, though he didn't speak the language, and somewhere else along the rail, he heard another man making a sound that might have been crying, or might have been the involuntary keening that comes when the mind encounters something it cannot accept. The figure seemed to notice the increased attention, though Pemberton couldn't have said how he knew this something in the angle of her head, perhaps, or the way her eyes moved along the line of men at the rail, as if she were counting them, memorizing their faces, recording information for purposes they could not guess. She opened her mouth, and what Pemberton saw inside confirmed everything he had already suspected about her inhumanity. The teeth were not human teeth. They were sharp and numerous, and arranged in rows that seemed to go back further than any mouth should have allowed. The kind of dentition that existed for one purpose only, the kind of teeth that belonged to predators at the top of food chains that humans had never been part of. Needle-thin and slightly curved, they caught the running lights and gleamed with a wet sheen that made Pemberton think of the specimens he had seen in natural history museums, prehistoric creatures whose remains had been preserved in ancient seafloors for millions of years. No sound emerged from that open mouth, or if one did, it was too low or too high for human ears to detect. But the display lasted long enough for every man at the rail to see it clearly before she closed her mouth and submerged again, diving with a smooth roll that showed more of her tail than Pemberton had yet seen. The men along the rail stood in silence waiting for her to return, and when she did 40 seconds later, 20 yards further aft, several of them made sounds that might have been relief or might have been renewed terror. The hour that followed was the longest of Harold Pemberton's life, longer than any night watch he had ever stood, longer than the worst stretches of his Navy service, longer than the 8 hours he had once spent in a life raft after a cargo ship sank beneath him in the St. Lawrence Seaway. Time seemed to stretch and compress in ways that defied the steady movement of the clock, each minute containing either an eternity or an instant, depending on whether the figure was visible or submerged. The crew remained at the rail, though Pemberton sent men back to their stations in rotation to ensure the ship continued to function. The engines needed monitoring, The helm needed manning. The basic requirements of keeping a 600-foot vessel moving safely through the night did not. Pause simply because the men responsible for those tasks had encountered something that challenged their understanding of reality. Nobody complained about being ordered away from the spectacle, and nobody lingered at their duties longer than absolutely necessary before returning to the port side to resume their watch. The figure continued her escort, maintaining her position off the beam with a precision that suggested she could have done this forever, that the cold and the distance and the passage of time meant nothing to her. She surfaced at intervals that averaged between 45 seconds and 2 minutes, sometimes close enough to touch if anyone had been foolish enough to try, sometimes far enough away that she was visible only as a pale shape against the darker water. Each time she surfaced, her eyes found the men at the rail, not looking at the ship itself, not interested in the vessel as a machine, but watching the humans who lined its edge with an attention that felt deliberate and focused. Pemberton found himself wondering what she was waiting for, whether she was studying them the way they were studying her, whether she was curious or hungry or simply patient in ways that human minds couldn't comprehend. He found himself wondering how many other ships she had followed through these waters, how many crews had seen what they were seeing tonight and never spoken of it, how many vessels had disappeared on Superior with all hands and no explanation. The lake had claimed ships throughout recorded history. The Edmund Fitzgerald was only the most famous of a litany that stretched back to the earliest days of European navigation on these waters. Most of those losses were attributed to storms, to structural failures, to the particular malevolence of Superior's November gales that could turn a routine crossing into a death sentence within hours. But some of them had never been explained, had vanished in calm weather with experienced crews, and left behind no wreckage, no bodies, no evidence of what had gone wrong. Pemberton watched the figure pace them through the darkness and wondered if he was looking at an explanation that the maritime authorities had never considered an explanation they wouldn't have believed even if someone had possessed the courage to suggest it. The thought should have terrified him more than it did, but terror requires energy that the prolonged watching had drained away. What remained was something closer to awe, or perhaps to the particular stillness that comes when the mind has simply run out of responses to something beyond its capacity to process. At 1:30, Pemberton noticed something that the other men at the rail had apparently missed, or perhaps had seen, but had not wanted to acknowledge. The figure was moving differently than she had been. Her surfaces were lasting longer, her dives shorter, and she was positioning herself closer to the hull with each emergence. It was as if she was growing bolder as the hour progressed, as if the lack of aggression from the vessel had communicated something to her about the nature of the creatures she was observing. Or perhaps she was simply growing impatient, waiting for something to happen that the men watching her had no intention of providing. Pemberton turned to the captain, who had remained at the rail throughout the entire hour, his hands never leaving their grip on the metal, his eyes never leaving the water. "Sir, I think she's getting closer." Stoddard nodded without looking away from the figure. "I noticed. She was 50 yards out when we first saw her. She's inside of 20 now. Should we alter course? Try to put some distance between us?" The captain was silent for a moment, his jaw working as he considered the question. "What direction would you suggest, Mr. Pemberton? She's in open water. There's nowhere for us to go that she can't follow. If we turn away from her, she might interpret that as, I don't know, flight, weakness, something that changes whatever this is into something worse." The logic was sound, even if it offered no comfort. The Morell was a bulk freighter, not a patrol vessel. She could maintain 12 knots indefinitely, but she couldn't sprint, couldn't maneuver with any agility, couldn't escape from something that moved through the water as effortlessly as the figure appeared to. Running was not an option, and confrontation implied that they had some means of confronting, which they did not. All they could do was continue toward the Sulaks and hope that whatever was following them would choose to stop following before they arrived. At 1:45, The lights of the shipping channel became visible off the bow, the first evidence that the outside world still existed, that they were approaching civilization and the relatively sheltered waters near the Sioux locks. The figure seemed to notice the change in environment, or perhaps she sensed something in the water itself that Pemberton could not detect. She surfaced one final time, close enough to the hull that a man could have reached down and touched her if he had been foolish enough to try, and for a moment her eyes met Pemberton's directly. The first mate had looked into many eyes over the course of his 52 years, the eyes of dying men in Vietnam, the eyes of sailors lost at sea, the eyes of his wife when she told him their daughter had survived the difficult birth that had nearly killed them both. None of them had prepared him for what he saw in those black, lightless depths. There was intelligence there, a cold, impatient intelligence that regarded him not with hunger or hatred, but with something closer to appraisal, as if she were taking his measure and filing the information away for future reference. She knew what he was, he realized. She knew what all of them were, and she had been watching to learn whatever it was she wanted to know about the men who sailed these waters in their ships of steel. What she intended to do with that knowledge, whether the watching was prelude to something else or an end in itself, those were questions that Pemberton would carry for the rest of his life without ever finding answers. Then she dove, and this time she did not resurface. The men at the rail stood watching the water for another 20 minutes, waiting for her to return, but the black surface of Lake Superior remained empty except for the reflection of their own running lights. By the time the Morell entered the shipping channel and began her approach to the Sioux locks, the figure had been gone for long enough that some of the men had begun to question whether she had ever been there at all. Pemberton could see it in their faces, the desperate hope that this had been a collective hallucination, a shared madness brought on by fatigue and darkness, and the particular strangeness of Lake Superior on November nights. He understood the impulse. He felt it himself, the temptation to dismiss what he had seen as a dream or a trick of the light or the product of a mind that had finally snapped after decades of watching the dark water. But the trembling in his hands told a different story, and the expression on Captain Stoddard's face told it as well. What they had seen had been real. What they had seen was still out there, somewhere beneath the black surface of the largest freshwater lake on Earth. And now they had to decide what to do about it. Pemberton assembled the crew in the mess hall at 2:30, with the captain's permission and presence, and addressed them with a directness that left no room for misunderstanding. What we saw tonight does not go in any official report. What we saw tonight does not get discussed with anyone outside this crew, not your wives, not your friends, not the dock workers at the Sioux. What we saw tonight will cost you your merchant mariner credentials if you report it to any maritime authority, because they will conclude that you were drunk or delusional, or both, and they will pull your papers faster than you can say, "Unexplained phenomenon." He paused, looking at the faces of men he had worked alongside for years, men he trusted with his life every time they put to sea. I'm not telling you what to believe about what you saw. I'm not asking you to forget it or pretend it didn't happen. I'm telling you that your careers, your livelihoods, your ability to support your families, all of that depends on keeping your mouths shut. What happened tonight stays on this ship. Is that understood? The men nodded, some reluctantly, some with evident relief that someone had given them permission to bury what they had witnessed. Captain Stoddard added nothing to Pemberton's speech, simply standing beside his first mate with an expression that suggested he agreed completely with every word. The logbook entry for that night read simply, "Unusual marine wildlife observation, port side 00400145. No action required." Pemberton wrote those words himself in his careful handwriting, knowing that they were both technically true and completely inadequate to describe what had actually occurred. The Daniel J. Morell completed her transit through the Sioux locks without incident and continued her voyage down to the steel mills of Indiana, where her cargo of iron ore pellets was offloaded over the course of 2 gray November days. The crew dispersed to their homes and their families, carrying with them a shared secret that most of them would never acknowledge again. In the weeks that followed, Pemberton noticed changes in some of his crewmates, a reluctance to take night watches, a tendency to avoid the port rail during superior crossings, a haunted quality in their eyes when the conversation turned to stories of the lakes. Some of them requested transfers to other vessels before the next shipping season began, citing family reasons or personal preferences, or simply expressing a desire for a change of scenery. None of them mentioned Lake Superior by name, but Pemberton noticed that several of them seemed to have lost their taste for the inland seas entirely, gravitating toward coastal shipping or river work, or the merchant marine routes that stayed far from the cold, deep waters where the impossible had made itself known. Michael Brewer, the oiler who had crossed himself when the figure first surfaced, left shipping entirely by 1979 and spent the rest of his working life as a machinist in a factory outside Cleveland. He never set foot on a boat again, not even the fishing charters that his brothers invited him on every summer. And when asked about his abrupt career change, he would only say that he'd seen enough of the water to last him a lifetime. Pemberton himself continued sailing on the lakes for another 8 years, eventually making captain of a smaller freighter that worked the iron ore routes between Duluth and Cleveland. He crossed Lake Superior hundreds of times during those years, in every season and every weather condition the lake could produce, and he never saw the figure again. But he looked for her. Every night watch, every crossing, every passage through the waters east of Whitefish Point, he found his eyes drawn to the port rail, scanning the black surface of the lake for a movement that didn't match the waves, a pale shape that might break the surface and remind him that the world contained things beyond the scope of his understanding. Sometimes he caught himself hoping he would see her, if only to confirm that the memory was real, that the night of November 14th, 1977, had actually happened the way he remembered it, and hadn't slowly transformed into something unrecognizable in the years since. More often, he found himself hoping he wouldn't. He retired in 1985, settling into a small house near Sault Ste. Marie that overlooked the locks where the figure had finally disappeared. He spent his mornings watching the freighters pass through, recognizing vessels he had sailed and men he had worked with, feeling the particular melancholy of a man whose useful years were behind him. He told his wife about the encounter 3 months before he died, in a hospital bed where the cancer had reduced him to a man who no longer cared what anyone thought about his sanity. She listened without interrupting, held his hand when he finished, and said only, "I always knew there was something. Some night you never talked about. I could see it in you sometimes, when you'd wake up from dreams you wouldn't describe." Pemberton died on March 7, 1992, with his wife beside him and his secret finally shared. Of the 23 men who witnessed the figure that November night, only 4 ever confirmed the account publicly. Thomas Kowalski was the first, giving an interview to a maritime historian in 2003 that was dismissed as the ramblings of an elderly man seeking attention. Michael Brewer, the oiler who had fled shipping for factory work, confirmed Kowalski's account in a letter written 6 weeks before his death from emphysema in 2007. James Whitehorse, a deckhand of Ojibwe descent who had been 26 years old in 1977, spoke to his grandson about it in 2011, providing details that matched the other accounts, precisely despite having had no contact with either Kowalski or Brewer in decades. He told his grandson that his people had always known there were things in Superior that Europeans had never been told about, had always known, and had always had the good sense to leave alone. And Harold Pemberton's widow, acting on her husband's deathbed request, released a copy of his private journal to a researcher in 2019, a journal that contained a detailed description of the encounter, the figure's appearance, and the first mate's conviction that whatever they had seen was no hoax, no misidentification, no fevered dream of men too long at sea. The entries had been written in the weeks following the encounter, while the memory was still fresh, and they matched the other accounts, with an accuracy that suggested either remarkable coordination or remarkable truth. The Daniel J. Morell herself continued sailing until 1989, when she was finally scrapped at a breaker's yard in India. Her steel recycled into products that scattered across the world, carrying no memory of the November night when something paced her through the darkness of Lake Superior. Lake Superior remains the deepest and coldest of the Great Lakes, with temperatures near the bottom that hover just above freezing year-round and depths that have never been fully explored. The lake holds 10% of the world's surface freshwater, enough to cover the entire landmass of North and South America to a depth of 1 foot. Its waters are so cold that bodies do not decompose the way they do in warmer lakes. The chemical processes that break down organic matter slow to near cessation in the frigid depths, preserving things that should have rotted away decades or centuries ago. Maritime authorities will tell you that the lake claims vessels due to its legendary storms, its unpredictable weather patterns, its waves that can reach heights normally associated with ocean gales. They will not tell you about the reports that have filtered in over the decades, from sailors and fishermen and Coast Guard personnel, reports that are dismissed and filed away and never spoken of publicly. Reports of figures in the water where no figures should be. Reports of things that pace vessels through the darkness. Reports of eyes that hold no light, watching from just below the surface. The Ojibwe, who lived on Superior's shores for thousands of years before European contact, had their own names for what dwelt in the lake, their own warnings about traveling certain waters after dark, their own rituals meant to appease forces that they understood could never be controlled. Most of that knowledge has been lost or suppressed or dismissed as superstition by generations of Americans who believed that nothing in a lake could possibly threaten them. Harold Pemberton knew better. He knew that Lake Superior kept secrets that would never appear in any official report, any maritime history, any navigation chart. He knew that 23 men had seen something impossible on the night of November 14, 1977, and that most of them had chosen to bury that knowledge rather than face its implications. And he knew in the quiet hours of his final days, when the morphine made the boundary between memory and dream uncertain, that whatever had followed the Daniel J. Morell was still out there, still swimming through waters cold enough to kill a human in minutes, still watching the vessels that crossed her domain, still waiting for something that only she understood. If you've ever worked the Great Lakes, if you've ever heard stories that the official histories don't include, if you've ever seen something in the water that you couldn't explain, we want to hear about it. Leave your account in the comments below. Some things shouldn't stay buried forever. Subscribe to Maritime Incident Files for more accounts from the deep.